Namaskar. Good evening. Unit number 2, definition of knowledge and its basic assumptions. Objectives: to provide the students with some basic notion of knowledge, to introduce some complex issues of epistemology like knowledge, truth, certainty, and justification, to see the relationship among knowledge, reasonableness, and justification. Introduction: before we study epistemology, it is better to have a refined understanding of knowledge and truth. In this introductory unit, we try to do precisely that. After having taken up the process of knowing, we relate it to truth and some basic assumptions for both of them. To know. Here we are, of course, concerned with the technical, philosophical, or epistemological meaning of the term to know. In fact, most words in all languages have more than one meaning, but not all of them are useful in a philosophical discourse. In English, to know can mean, for example, to recognize or identify, to be acquainted with thing, place, or person, to be versed in language, skills, etc. What are we to understand by to know in an epistemological sense? Some thinkers point out that it is not possible to give an exact definition of to know or knowledge. They claim that, like the basic words to see or to hear, to know is such a primary fact of experience. So one can only describe the activity involved by giving examples. To a man born blind, it is impossible to tell him what to see means. Similarly, to a man born deaf, it is impossible to tell him what to hear means. Of course, to a man born totally an imbecile, unable to know anything at all, it is not possible to tell him anything. And be that as it may, we can always suggest a loose definition for to know, or at least description or of what understand by this term. The way we prefer to understand the term is this: to know is to be aware that such and such is or is not the case. This obviously needs explaining. Number one, to be aware, to be conscious of, to be alert to be cognizant of. For our purposes here, we need not go into a detailed analysis of awareness. So suffice is it to point out that this commonly accepted understanding of awareness implies a duality of subject, the knower, and object, the known. An interesting topic which can be discussed in whether the subject can ever become aware of himself as subject but not as object. In other words, whether there is such a state of objectless awareness. Many Indian schools of philosophy maintain that there is no matter puzzling this may sound. Hence the distinction between sa, samvedan or sangya object awareness, and chit or chaitanya objectless consciousness. For the moment, by awareness we shall understand object awareness. Second, such and such is or is not the case. This phrase refers to the object what is known. It denotes a fact, a state of affair, anything which one knows or claims to know. It includes therefore the existence, properties, and relation of things and persons, past, present, and likely future events, etc. 3 is or is not. This indicates a judgment, an affirmation, or negation. In fact, unless and until there is such a judgment, there cannot be knowledge in the way we are meaning the term. To understand this point, we can relate knowing with sense perceiving. Suppose I am given something in my hand. I can see its shape and color. I can smell and feel its hardness softness. Still, I may not yet know what it is. Only when I say it is a mango does knowledge emerge. Of course, in the meantime, I have already come to know many things. For example, that I am holding the thing in my hand, that it is round in shape and reddish in color, that it is soft or hard, even that it is not a baseball, etc. But notice that in all these fragmentary pieces of knowledge there is always entailed a judgment. Eh, it is the case that I am holding something in my hand. It is the case that it is round in shape and reddish in color, etc. Some further remarks. A first remark would be this: the act of judgment implied in to know need not and often is not explicit. When I get to know something, I may not be alert to the fact that I in fact am making this fact of judgment. In everyday life, where we get to know things spontaneously, only on reflection can I become alert to the fact that in every act of knowing the act of judgment is implied. So this act is said to be at least implicitly implied. A second remark would be this is or is not the case can obviously refer to the past. Suppose I say that I know that Jesus lived 20 century ago. This means that I am aware that it is the case that it is the case that Jesus lived 20 centuries ago. Again, when I say that I know that all human beings will be finally happy, I am saying that I am aware that this is the case that all humans will be finally happy. A third remark would be this: to make a judgment is an act, a mental act, whereas we describe to know as to be aware. But is to be aware an act, or rather a state? To know can refer either to the practice, either to the precise moment when one gets to know something, and in this case to know refers to more directly to the mental act. To know would correspond to the moment when one understands something, but to know can also refer to the time afterward. When one can got to know something, he keeps on knowing it till, of course, one is proved wrong or persuaded otherwise. In this case, to know refers more directly to the state of awareness. But this brings us to say something about knowledge as a noun. Knowledge. We have been speaking for obvious reasons of to know and of knowledge in one breath. In our understanding, knowledge is simply the content of one's knowing, of one's understanding. Some Indian philosophers distinguish knowledge from what is stored up, as it were, in memory, depending precisely on what each of them understand by the former term. The question or questions which we would like to discuss here is whether the way we understand to know leads us to understand knowledge as necessarily true and reasonable. In other words, is knowledge to be really knowledge in our understanding of the term, either true or reasonable, or no knowledge at all? Does it make sense to speak of false knowledge or unreasonable knowledge? Aren't these contradictions in terms? Later on, we shall discuss the topics of truth and certainty, but what we shall be discussing here is necessary to complete our understanding of knowledge itself. Number one, knowledge and truth. For a moment, by truth, we understand the following: true knowledge is that where what is asserted or denied corresponds to what the case is. If I say that the principal is in his office and in point of fact he is not, my statement is not true but false. If I deny that I went to Mumbai yesterday and in point of fact I did go, my denial is not true but false. Now suppose that I say that I know that the author of the one of the book is in the Bible is Saint John. Later on in my studies of scripture, I discovered that this is not the case. On my discovery, will I be able to say that formally I knew that the author of this book in the Bible is Saint John? or rather that I thought I knew that this is the case, but that as a matter of fact I was mistaken and did not know at all. Strictly speaking, then, if knowledge is really knowledge, it has to be true. In common knowledge, however, false knowledge can still make sense, but only to the extent that what is meant is that what one thinks one knows is false. Second, knowledge and reasonableness. A further but connected question is this: is knowledge, no matter how true, but which is based on false or inadequate reasons, knowledge at all? In other words, is knowledge to be called knowledge in our understanding of the term necessarily reasonable, based on sufficient or adequate reasons? Suppose I say that I know that physical evil exists in the world, and the reason I give for this assertion is that God could not have created nature in a way other than he has. Supposing that the assertion is true but the reason given is false, can I still be said to really know that physical evil exists in the world? Or to take another example, I hear somebody saying that he knows that abortion is morally wrong and the only reason for that is that it is illegal. Can he be said to really know that abortion is morally wrong? Our answer would be the following in both cases: given that the claimed knowledge is based on false reasons, the speakers does not seem to know what they are really talking about. Hence, their claimed knowledge is to knowledge at all. Is claimed knowledge is no knowledge at all. That was the case when the abducted reasons are false. But let us take the case when the reasons abducted are not false but simply inadequate. My mother says she knows that sacraments confers grace, and the reason for this is that the parish priest says so. We shall have to return to such a topic later, when one's knowledge is based on the witness of supposedly competent authority. But here our answer to the question raised would be this: given that the reason given is adequate, even if not fully sufficient, the claimed knowledge is real knowledge but insufficient. Truth and reasonableness and are therefore essential properties, denying characteristics of knowledge as we understand the term. But this conclusion raises in its turn another very serious an important question. For if such is the case, can I be said to be really know anything unless and until I am certain that what I know is true and reasonable? And is there anything which I can know in such a way? We shall try and tackle this question after we have discussed truth and certainty at some length later. Concepts and propositions. We have said that to know implies explicitly or implicitly a judgment, which we defined as an assertion or denial. As a affirmation or denial, we would like here to analyze a little further the nature of a judgment, unexpressed or expressed judgment. I can make a judgment in my heart of hearts, as it were, or simply internally when I express it externally, either to myself or to somebody else. I use words which together from a proposition. For example, God exists. The proposition is therefore the verbal outward expression of of a judgment. Obviously, this can be done either orally or in writing. Second, analysis of a preposition. Every proposition is a judgment, an assertion or denial of a fact. Besides the duality of which we have already spoken and implied in awareness, there is in every proposition another duality, this time of whom or what something is affirmed or denied, the subject, and what is affirmed or denied, the predicate. The affirmation or denial itself is expressed by the verb is, either explicitly or implicitly. A proposition in modern Western philosophy is therefore to be distinguished from a non-propositional sentence. a command, an interrogation, and exclamation, etc. It is clear that only propositions can be proved or said to be true or false. Number three, locucius, locucius and elocutions. In modern analytic philosophy, such terms have been common and they throw a certain amount of light on the epistemological questions with which we shall have to deal. Locution stands for the utterance itself. Elocution stands for what besides uttering the words I am doing. For example, I utter a words, God loves you. Besides saying these three words, the first speech act, I may be able to instill hope in somebody who is depressed. Of course, one locution can have more than one elocution, depending on my intention and the situation. Another term used is perlocution, which, to avoid unnecessary complication, we shall here overlook. Following some philosophers, we can group elocutions under four healings: the const, constitutives, by which a certain state of affair is affirmed or denied; expressives, by which certain emotions like wonder, trust, love, gratitude, joy, wish, etc. are expressed; commissives, by which certain commitments, intentions, decisions are made; and prescriptive, by which certain commands, recommendations, appointments, etc. are performed. It is clear that only constitutives corresponds to propositions strictly so called. We have just said, however, that a sentence can have more than one elocution. This means, therefore, that a given sentence may be considered a proposition in view of its constitutive locution, and a non proposition in view of its, say, prescriptive locution. Number four, concepts. If we analyze the proposition a little further, or for that matter, language in general, we discover that often we use such general terms as man, animal, soul, tree, book, etc. Now it is clear that man, animal, etc. do not exist in reality, but only man, animals, etc. And yet we often affirm or deny things about them. For example, man is created by God. The soul of animal is different from that of man. A term denoting a class of being we call a concept. In scholastic philosophy, it differs from an idea in that this simply stands for a mental representation of an object. Notice, however, that in Western philosophy these terms are used differently, oftentimes in accordance with different philosophical assumptions. Since a concept, as said, denotes a class of being, it is a universal idea of that whole class. The question just referred to, namely, how is that we can affirm or deny things about realities which, as universal, do not exist, has given rise, both in Western and in Indian philosophy, significantly enough to what has come down to be known as the problem of the universals. All kind of propositions have been taken, ranging from that which maintains that concepts are mere words, images of singular objects, constructions of thought, apohas without any objective foundation in reality, nominalism, to the other extreme position which maintains that concepts correspond to realities existing in themselves, jati. Radical realism. The problem is treated not only in epistemology, psychology, and metaphysics. In epistemology, the question is, what is the epistemic value of concepts? In psychology, the question is, how do we really form concepts in our mind? And in metaphysics, we ask, do the concept refer to a universal reality itself, existing in itself, externally to man's mind? If yes, where and how? We shall refrain from discussing this problem. Already in the Middle Ages, an author cynically remarked that philosophers have spent more time discussing the problem of universals than Alexander spent in conquering the whole world. What would he have said that has what would he have said had he lived up to today? It is that kind of problem which has given to philosophy a bad name and made it seem to many a much ado about nothing. Still, one cannot deny that the assumptions and conclusions of a philosophical stance taken on the problem have important consequences on one's philosophical system as a whole. This will become clearer with an example. Suppose, for example, I say that all we can know are our sense impressions or the images left on the senses by the objects. I would have to conclude then not only that the concepts are mere images, but that I cannot know anything at all which is not sense perceptible. Can I know then anything about God? What becomes of my religious belief? Any book or treatise on epistemology usually treats of this problem. All of us we take the following stance, whose assumptions and conclusions will become clear during the rest of our study on epistemology. It agrees with the stance taken by scholasticism and other Indian philosophical systems, including Kumarila's Mimamsa, Dvaita, Shaiva Siddhant, and Jaina. Humans are capable both of having percepts when I see a particular singular person and of forming concepts as of persons in general. This is possible because of essential properties common to particular singular objects. A human being is capable of perceiving these properties, abstracting them from the objects as it were, and think of them as identities applicable to many. Concepts have epistemic value. They serve in our knowledge of reality. Without them, no language would be possible, nor any progress in the natural sciences themselves. To deny this value to concepts would be to deny any cognitive value to the language by which this denial itself is expressed. As such, as universal ideas, concepts are the result of human beings' understanding of reality, of objects in their singularity and in their commonality of properties. Now, as the proposition is a verbal expression of a judgment, so a noun is a verbal expression of a concept, a conventional sign which we use to refer to it. It can also be said to be a tool or instrument which we use to express the concept. But as in the judgment, so in the forming of of a concept, much activity on the part of the knower is involved. By means of concepts and judgments, man constructs a reality, making it intelligible. Knowledge and truth. In our understanding, the term knowledge is essentially true. We saw that this corresponds to the Indian term prama. We can claim that by true we provisionally mean corresponding to what the case is. Now, in the history of philosophy, both in the West and the East, we come across various understandings of the terms true or truth. From each we can learn a lot. So before we definitely settle for what are going to understand by true, it is good to examine carefully these various understandings. The question which is usually raised in this context is this: what is the criterion or test or of truth? This is how am I going to know that what I am affirming or denying is true or false. In any case, the understanding of one means by true can help us answer the question which we already raised in the first chapter, whether I can be said to really know until and unless I am certain that what I know is true and reasonable. General implications of truth and knowledge. It is clear that no matter the different understandings of the term true, we are here concerned with the term as qualifying a judgment expressed or unexpressed in a proposition and of a proposition of the constative elocution type. In other words, we are here concerned with epistemological truth. In fact, the term true can be used to qualify a person or a thing. as he is a true patriot, or this is a true whiskey, by which is meant in the first case ideal, in the second genuine. In metaphysics, one usually distinguishes between this epistemological or logical truth as opposed to error, from moral truth the opposed to a lie, and ontological or transcendental truth as opposed to non-being. In logic, we take pains to distinguish between truth and validity, but please note that often, even in philosophical literature, these two words are used interchangeably. Now, speaking of the criterion or test of truth, we have to clarify the notion of evidence for clarity. That principle or standard criterion by which we judge whether a judgment is true or false is precisely evidence. What is evidence? We have already spoken of a self-evident truth as one which is seen directly and immediately. But at the stage we look evident in the generally accepted meaning of the term. Here we have to clarify the notion a little better. By evidence, we therefore mean that clarity, obviousness, conspicuity, serving to indicate, attested to the truth of the judgment. Roughly speaking, it can be called proof. I say that Mr. X is in his room. What is evidence or proof that what I am saying is true? It may be that I just say him going into his room. For me, it is clear, evident that what I am saying is true. Or it may be that I have just seen told by a reliable person. In this case, for me, it is clear that what I am saying is true. Now, since as in the later case, the reliable person may have been mistaken, and therefore what is clear to me subjectively speaking may not have corresponded to the facts as to the truth. uh, Truth, objectively speaking, the question arises what kind or degree or of objective evidence is required. If this is at all possible for me to say that I am absolutely sure that what I am saying is true, this brings us once again to the problem of certitude, which we shall be treated later. Still, the notion of evidence as expressed here is sufficient, we think, to follow intelligently that admittedly difficult problem regarding truth. Apart from the question about certitude, two other questions have to be distinguished. It seems to us that a greater agreement on this question regarding truth could have been achieved in the history of philosophy, whether in the West or in the East. If these questions have been distinguished, the first question, the semantic, is this: what am I going to understand by the term true? The second question, the epistemological, is this: if the criterion of truth is subjective, truth is objective, evidence, is this objective evidence possible at all? And if this is possible, what amount of clarity is sufficient and necessary for me to say that I am certain of what I am affirming or denying? These two questions or set of questions are so distinct that I could, for example, find myself able to say that no objective evidence in any field of knowledge is at all possible. Whereas in the West, especially in more modern times, this distinction could have helped the context of the discussion about cognition, jnana, buddhi. The question raised and enthusiastically debates was what is the nature of true and valid cognition, prama. Most school of Indian philosophy agree on many points, but when the vexed question arises as to whether the truth or validity of cognition is intrinsic or extrinsic to it, opinions differ. Some says that cognition as such, jnana, can be either true or false, valid or invalid, and hence truth is extrinsic to it, nyaya. Others say that cognition as such is always true and valid, and it is only accidentally by the defects of the instrumental cause, that it can be invalid and false, and therefore truth and validity are always intrinsic to it, and only falsity and invalidity are extrinsic to it. Mimamsa. Again, other says that cognition as such is always false and invalid, and it is only through extraneous factors, as like achieving an intended aim, that it can be true and valid, and hence truth and validity are always extrinsic, whereas falsity and invalidity are intrinsic. Buddhism. A very careful perusal of the points at issue can reveal that here the two questions, the semantic and epistemological, are dealt with in one breath, whereas it would have been better to distinguish better between the two. In fact, to ask whether truth and validity belong to cognition intrinsically or extrinsically can be resolved into the question, but what are we going to understand by cognition? This is the semantic question. If we ask what is the nature of cognition, it becomes a metaphysical question. Now, if we agree to call cognition only true and valid cognition, then the question whether truth and validity belong to it intrinsically or extrinsically would not arise, for it would have been solved by the very understanding definition of the term. Once we would have agreed what to call cognition, then then and only then would we pass to the other question regarding the possibility and type of objective evidence sufficient and necessary to meet our already established meaning of cognition, the epistemological question. As we proceed to examine the theories of truth in the West and the East, we shall keep the distinctness of the two questions always in mind. Let us sum up. In this unit, we have seen the four prominent theories of truth and spoken of error as related to and different from truth. To know is to be aware that such and such is or is not the case. Truth and reasonableness are therefore essential properties defining characteristics of knowledge as we understand the term. The term denoting a class of being we call a concept in scholastic philosophy. It differs from an idea in that this simply stands for a mental representation of an object. In metaphysics, one usually distinguishes between this epistemological or logical truth as opposed to error from moral truth as opposed to a lie, and ontological or transcendental truth as opposed to non-being. By evidence we mean that clarity, obviousness, conspicuity, serving to indicate attested to the truth of the judgment. Roughly speaking, it can be called proof. We can group elocutions under four headings: the constitutives by which a certain state of affair is affirmed or denied; expressives by which certain emotions like wonder, trust, love, gratitude, joy, wish, etc. are expressed; commi- commi- commissives by which certain commitments, intentions, decisions are made; and and prescriptives by which certain commands, recommendations, appointments, etc. are performed. Keywords: nominalism, the doctrine holding that abstract concepts, general terms, or universals have no independent existence but exist only as names. Locution, the act of expressing, conveying, or representing in words, arts, music, or movement. Elocution, the intent or the intention of a speaker in saying a particular thing, as naming, threatening, warning, etc. Elocutions may be further divided into the constitutives by which a certain state of affair is affirmed or denied; expressives by which certain emotions like wonder, trust, love, gratitude, joy, wish, etc. are expressed; commissives by which certain commitments, intentions, decisions are made; and prescriptives by which certain commands, recommendations, appointments, etc. are performed. Thank you.